Hey, before we get into this, I want you to do something for me. Think about how many hours you've spent in Yharnam. Think about the lanterns, the blood echoes, the hunters you've fought, the bosses that wrecked you the first time. Now ask yourself, did you ever actually go into the Chalice dungeons? Not just dip in for a trophy or a weapon upgrade, but really go in? Because if you didn't, and honestly most people didn't, then you missed what I genuinely believe is the most devastating, most emotionally layered, and most cinematically rich piece of storytelling in the entire game. Maybe in any From Software game, period. And that is not a take I'm throwing out lightly. Today we're going in deep. We're talking about Queen Yharnam, her connection to Mergo, the Great Ones, and the buried mythology that Miyazaki and his team hid so far beneath the surface that most players never even knew it existed. We're also going to talk about why this specific storyline is basically begging to be a film. Not in a cheap, cash grab adaptation way. In a genuine, A24 horror meets cosmic tragedy way that could sit comfortably alongside something like Annihilation or Hereditary. So buckle up because this one goes deep. Let's start with what most players do know. You fight Mergo's wet nurse near the end of the game. It's a terrifying, brilliant boss encounter. You're standing in this void, this half-dimension that feels like it's between sleep and death, and this enormous creature that looks like it was designed by someone who hates sleep unfolds itself and attacks you. After you beat it, you hear a baby stop crying. The game treats this as a win. But the more you understand about who Mergo is and who that baby's mother was, the more that silence feels less like victory and more like tragedy. Mergo is a great one, or at least a great one's child, a being that exists beyond the physical, that cries from somewhere you can never quite reach. The wet nurse is not a monster. It's a caretaker, a grief-shaped guardian folding reality around a child that may or may not even be alive in any conventional sense. And the mother of that child is Queen Yharnam, and her story is one that the game barely whispers to you unless you go looking for it. Here's the thing about Bloodborne's narrative structure that I think is really important to understand before we keep going. Miyazaki does not tell stories. He hides them. He buries them in item descriptions, in NPC dialogue, in environmental details, and, in this case, in an optional dungeon system that most players treat like a side activity. The Chalice dungeons feel procedurally generated and kind of disconnected from the main narrative, which is honestly part of why people skip them. But beneath them, physically and narratively, is where Bloodborne's oldest and darkest history lives. These are not side content. These are the origin. The great Cimmerian civilization came before Yharnam as we know it. These were people, human beings, who discovered the Great Ones first. They made contact. They performed rituals. They dug deeper, literally and metaphorically, in search of something they probably didn't have a word for. Transcendence, maybe. Power. Knowledge of the cosmos. What they found instead was something that doesn't care about human desire at all, because the Great Ones don't operate on any scale that includes us in a meaningful way. And the Cimmerians paid for that contact in ways that echo across centuries and eventually become the entire foundation of the plague we're dealing with throughout the main game. Queen Yharnam is the last major ruler of this civilization, and her story is the part that breaks me a little, honestly, because it's not a story of ambition in the way we usually frame in fantasy. It's a story of a woman who became something a Great One needed and had no real say in any of it. The theory, and it's supported by a significant amount of item lore and environmental storytelling, is that Queen Yharnam bore the child of a Great One. That child is Mergo, and bearing a Great One's child, even surviving it, required her to be transformed, to become something between human and divine, to be elevated to a status that sounds like a blessing until you actually look at her. You encounter her as a boss in the Cimmerian Queen fight within the Chalice dungeons, and she is haunting. She does not attack you the way other bosses do. She weeps. She bleeds. She stands there and drips blood, and her main form of offense is literally her grief made manifest, her blood becoming the weapon. She is not fighting you because she wants to. She is something that has been so thoroughly consumed by loss and transformation that the fight itself feels like a violation. After you defeat her, if you read carefully, she is described as both dead and not dead. She exists in some liminal state, mourning endlessly. Mergo's cry that persists throughout the late game is not just atmospheric horror. It is specifically tied to her. The Great Ones lose their children, and that grief warps reality. It causes nightmares. It causes the kind of psychic disturbance that the healing church eventually stumbles into when they start digging around in Pthumerian history. Queen Yharnam's tragedy does not stay contained to the ancient past. It bleeds forward through time and becomes the rot at the center of everything you're experiencing in Yharnam on the night of the hunt. Now I want to talk about some of the characters who fill in the connective tissue here, because this story doesn't exist in isolation, and the way these figures relate to each other is genuinely fascinating from a narrative standpoint. From the vacuous spider. She is one of the most misunderstood bosses in the game, and I mean that sincerely. Players see a giant spider in a moonlit lake and think it's just another cosmic horror set piece. But Rom was human. She ascended. She was granted insight beyond what the human mind is built to hold. And what she does with that insight is maintain a veil. She is literally keeping a secret for the cosmos. The Mergo situation, the blood moon, the true state of Yharnam, Rom is the lock on that door. When you kill her, the veil drops. The blood moon rises. The nightmare gets louder. Killing Rom isn't triumphant. It's you unknowingly tearing down something that was, in its own broken way, trying to hold things together. And then there's Michaelash. Oh, Michaelash. He is the game's most intentionally theatrical character, running from you through a looping nightmare palace, screaming about eyes and the cosmos, begging Kos, or some say Cosm, to grant him eyes on the inside. He is funny, and he is terrifying, and he is pathetic in the most sympathetic way. Because what Michaelash represents is the human need to understand. He looked at the Great Ones, and instead of running, he leaned in. He wanted contact so badly that he trapped himself in a nightmare deliberately so he could stay close to it. He is what happens when intellectual curiosity meets something that was never designed for human consumption. He's what a lot of the healing church scholars became, which is the question given flesh and voice and a cage helmet. Mergo's wet nurse doesn't get dialogue, doesn't get any lore description that gives it a personality. It simply exists in that between space and protects. And somehow that silence makes it more affecting than almost any other boss in the game. It is grief that has taken the shape of duty. It is something that has been folded around loss so completely that it has no identity apart from the act of protection itself. When you kill it and the crying stops, I think the correct feeling is not relief. It's a kind of hollow sorrow that the game never explicitly names for you. So why does this work as a movie? Let me lay it out for you, because I've thought about this more than I'd like to admit. The structural problem with adapting most video games to film is that games are fundamentally about agency. You're the one making choices. The story serves your movement through the world. Strip that out, and a lot of game narrative collapse because they were never really designed to be watched. Bloodborne is different, and Queen Yharnam's story specifically is different because it is entirely about passivity. It is about what happens to people who have no agency in the face of something cosmically indifferent to their suffering. That is an extraordinarily cinematic premise. You don't need a player character to explore that. You need a camera. Think about the film you could build around this. Open an ancient Pthumeria. Show a civilization at its height, brilliant and curious and hungry for the kind of knowledge that's always described as forbidden because the people describing it as forbidden don't know how to explain what the actual danger is. Show the first contact with the Great Ones not as a horror set piece, but as something genuinely transcendent and wrong in equal measure. The way Annihilation handles the alien, as something that doesn't wish you harm and doesn't wish you anything at all, which is somehow worse. And at the center of it, Queen Yharnam. A ruler, a person, a woman who is chosen for something she did not choose, whose body becomes the site of an event she cannot consent to or refuse, who survives it and then has to survive the survival. The cosmic horror genre works best, I think, when the horror is not the monster but the scale, the realization that you do not matter in the way you thought you did. Lovecraft understood this, even if his execution of it was mired in his own very ugly biases. What Bloodborne does that Lovecraft rarely managed is make that horror personal. It gives you Queen Yharnam weeping. It gives you Michael Ash screaming his love for something that doesn't know he exists. It gives you Rom, frozen in purpose, holding a secret she probably doesn't understand either. The scale is cosmic, but the suffering is human, and that gap between those two things is where every great horror film lives. The theme of cycles is also something a film could do extraordinary things with. Bloodborne is obsessed with cycles. The night of the hunt happens again and again. The plague rises and is managed and rises again. The great ones lose children, and that grief warps everything around it indefinitely. A film adaptation could use this structurally, could build a story that rhymes with itself, where you see the Themerian era and then see Yharnam and recognize the same mistakes being made with the same confidence and the same blindness. The way Oppenheimer rhymes with Trinity, or the way Chinatown's final line recontextualizes everything. Cycles work in cinema when they're built into the architecture of the story itself. Human ambition, fear of the unknown, the violence of contact between things that do not share a scale of experience. These are not just horror themes. These are the questions that the best science fiction and literary horror, and even certain kinds of tragedy, have always been organized around. Bloodborne has all of them, and it has them in a story that most people who played the game never fully encountered. That's not a flaw. That's actually kind of a perfect metaphor for the themes themselves. The truth is buried deep, and most people never go looking. Here is what I keep coming back to, the thing that makes me want to make this video every time I think about it. Queen Yharnam is not a villain. She's not a hero. She's not a cautionary tale in the way that label gets applied to justify a character's suffering as educational. She is someone who existed at the intersection of human civilization and something utterly beyond it, and she paid for that proximity in ways that echo forward through history into every corpse you step over in Yharnam. Her grief is not decorative. Her grief is structural. Her grief is why the world of this game is the way it is. And nobody talks about her. She's a boss that most players skip entirely or fight for a material drop without reading a single description. The whole civilization she ruled, the whole ancient history of contact and consequence that underpins the main narrative, exists in a dungeon system that the game's own community has historically underrated and dismissed. There's something genuinely melancholy about that even in the real world, the people who carry the most important parts of story are often the ones who get skipped. A film changes that. A film makes Queen Yharnam the center. It forces you to sit with her, to watch what happened to her, to understand what it costs a civilization to make contact with something infinite. It gives Mergo a face, or the meaningful absence of one. It lets the wet nurse be what it actually is, which is the most loyal and heartbreaking guardian in the entire game, folded around a grief it was built to protect. Bloodborne deserves a real adaptation, not a streaming cash-in, not a fan service product. A real, serious, atmospheric, emotionally ambitious film built around the story that the game itself buries the deepest, because that story is the one worth excavating. Queen Yharnam is waiting at the bottom of all those chalice dungeons, still weeping, still bleeding, still holding the weight of everything that came after her. The very least we could do is finally go down there and listen.